Welcome to our study of the Gospel of Matthew. Last week we talked about Jesus, and he was in the garden with his disciples. And as we left them last lesson, Jesus was leaving the garden because Judas and his band of, his crowd, the crowd with him, was coming. So we are going to pick up at Matthew 26, verse 47. While Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now, why the swords and clubs? Why did they feel the need to send this crowd armed with swords and clubs? It could have been that maybe Judas was expecting some kind of resistance. Maybe the chief priests and elders were expecting a resistance. Remember, without Judas, Jesus still had 11 disciples with him. And we know that they were always wanting to protect Jesus. Peter felt strongly about this, as we know. In last week's lesson, he said, I will die. I will die for you. I will never deny you. So he was ready. We'll see how ready he was a little bit later. Plus, the crowd knew that this man performed miracles. They may have seen some of his miracles. If they hadn't seen his miracles, they probably were aware of them. And if he could do what they had seen him do or been told about what he could do, then he was very powerful. So they came armed. Now, the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. All right, why did they need a signal? Well, you would think that they needed a signal because they wouldn't recognize him. And this is probable, even though this crowd was made up probably of temple guards. There were temple guards there who had seen Jesus undoubtedly at the temple, may have even gotten close so they could hear what he was saying to report back to the chief priests and elders. So they knew what he looked like during the day. But it was not daylight now. It was nighttime. And they probably all had beards, Jesus, his disciples. They all dressed similarly. And only one who was close to Jesus would be able to recognize him at night. They didn't want someone to pretend to be Jesus and allow Jesus to escape. They wanted Jesus. They wanted to make sure it was Jesus that was arrested. So Judas goes to him, Greetings, Rabbi, stands in front of him, addresses him as Rabbi, and kissed him. Now, this kiss, the word kiss in the Greek, there are two words for kiss. One is a kiss of friendship, which is one kiss in a greeting. But the other kiss is when you kiss someone multiple times. This was the one that Judas used. That was the word that was used, that Matthew used. He kissed him several times. I don't know why. Maybe to make sure that the crowd saw who he was kissing. So then Jesus replied, Do what you came for, friend. Then the men stepped forward and seized Jesus and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. So, most of you know that this servant was Peter. Now, why didn't Matthew just say it was Peter? Well, it is probable that Matthew was writing during a time when Peter was still alive, and he did not want to get Peter in trouble. So he left out his name. These were dangerous times when Matthew was writing. So, do you remember the name of the servant that Peter struck? His name was Malchus, and he was the servant of the high priest. Cut off his ear. You will also recall that Jesus healed the ear. But Jesus tells Peter, put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Peter was ready, wasn't he? He was ready to die. This was his time. He took out the sword. He was a courageous man. He was willing to die for Jesus, and he proved that. But Jesus stopped him. He stopped him. No, no. Don't use the sword. You'll die by the sword. Then he makes a comment to all of his disciples. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? Now, one legion was 6,000 soldiers. So do the math, 72,000 angels. 12 legions. But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way? Scriptures had already talked about what was going to happen, and Jesus wasn't about to change it. In that hour, sometime during that hour, Matthew's not a chronological writer, so in that hour. It could have been when the crowd first got there, verse 55, or a little later, I don't know. But he says, in that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, am I leading a rebellion that you've come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sit in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. So he's referring to the messianic prophecies. Then continuing on with verse 56, then all the disciples deserted him and fled. And this was a fulfillment of Jesus' words back in Matthew 26. You remember that. This was the prophecy from Zechariah. Verse 57, those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. Now this is a model of the house of Caiaphas. They call it the palace of Caiaphas. And it says the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled here. So he was assembling his Sanhedrin, part of the Sanhedrin, to come to his house. Now, Matthew doesn't say it, but in other Gospels, they say that the first place Jesus was taken was to Annas. Now, I read about that, and Annas basically wanted to know about Jesus' teaching and about the disciples. Well, he didn't get anything out of Jesus, so Annas just went ahead and sent him on to Caiaphas' house. And it could be that they brought him to Annas to give Caiaphas time to get everybody he wanted there to assemble. All right. Then let's look at verse 58. Then it switches over from the house of Caiaphas to Peter. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. Okay, so remember, Peter is very courageous. All of the other disciples, except Peter and also John, we find in John that John knew the high priest, or the high priest knew John. And so he went with Jesus. But the rest of the disciples fled, but not Peter. Peter followed. Now, he followed at a distance, but he was being careful. He wanted to see what was going to happen to Jesus. So he goes right up to the courtyard of the high priest. That's pretty courageous, isn't it? And he entered the courtyard and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. Pretty bold of him, if you ask me. All right, back to the chief priests, verse 59. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. Notice what it says. It doesn't say they were looking for evidence, real evidence, to put him to death. It says they were looking for false evidence to put him to death. They had already tried and failed to find any real evidence against Jesus. So they have to go with the false. Now, the trial of Jesus can get a little complicated, so I want to break it down a little bit before we get more into it. It's really, the actual trial part is really in 3 parts. Annas, that part was not part of his trial, but this is part of his trial. So, the first part is going to be during the night at the high priest's palace, Caiaphas' palace. The second part will be first thing in the morning at the meeting of the Sanhedrin, which will be an official meeting. Then he will be sent to Pilate. He will stand before Pilate. All right, let us continue on. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. They didn't find any false testimony. That's what we're saying. Finally, 2 came forward. 2 false witnesses, and declared, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." Now, what he actually said, if you go back to John 2, verse 19, is, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." So, they are changing Jesus' words. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer?" He was very frustrated with Jesus. "What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. Here I want to talk just a little bit about the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is considered the supreme court of the Jews. There are 71 men in all that make up the Sanhedrin. You've got Sadducees, Pharisees, scribes, elders of the people, teachers of the law. A court of death needed a quorum of 23. Now, as I understand it, if they had 23, they had to have 23 to vote for the death penalty in order for them to put someone to death. Next, criminal cases. Criminal cases, according to the rules of the Sanhedrin, had to be tried and completed during the day. Not in one day, necessarily, but they were only allowed to try a criminal case during the day. They would adjourn for the night. And a case could not be completed the same day unless the verdict was not guilty. So if they were going to come back with a guilty verdict, they had to adjourn a criminal case that they had tried that day. They had to adjourn and come back the next day for the verdict if it was going to be guilty. Sanhedrin rules. All right, no criminal cases, none, could be tried during Passover season. And this was Passover. This was the day of Passover. In all trial cases, the evidence of innocence was heard first, all of them. Then the evidence of guilt. With Jesus, there was no evidence at all ever allowed for Jesus. So next, the no decision was valid unless made in the meeting place, which was where the Sanhedrin would meet. That's why they're going to meet again early the next morning, officially. All evidence had to be guaranteed by at least 2 witnesses. They had to be examined separately, and they were to have no contact with each other. Another thing, very important, a false witness was punishable by death. You bring false witness against someone, and you get the death penalty yourself. That was quite the deterrent for false witness, to be a false witness. But what was going on here? It's night, for one thing. It's a criminal case. They wanted the death penalty. And then let's just go back to verses 59 and 60. The chief priests were looking for false evidence. It says the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence. And then verse 60, they didn't find any, although many false witnesses came forward. Interesting. Many false witnesses came forward. And a false witness was supposed to get the death penalty. Yet many came. Why do you think that maybe many came forward? One, you think a little money might have been involved? Possibly. Also, maybe an assurance that if you bring false testimony, you would not be prosecuted. Very possible, and I would think very probable. So, in their eagerness to get rid of Jesus, they broke their own rules. The end of Jesus justified their means. The end justified the means. All right, let's continue. We're in 63. Caiaphas was frustrated with Jesus. He needed Jesus to condemn himself. So, this is what he said. And he knew these 2 false witnesses, their testimony was not going to get Jesus put to death. It just wasn't going to be enough. So the high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. You have said so, Jesus replied. Now that's a very vague answer to us, isn't it? But for a Jew, that was a yes. It was a yes. Now, this demand of Caiaphas, this shows that Caiaphas correctly understood the claim of Jesus. He knew who Jesus claimed to be. And whether he believed it or not, he wanted him gone. So, he put him under oath and said, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus said, you've said so, but he continues, this is like the first time he's said anything, but I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. This is from Daniel 7. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, he has spoken blasphemy. This is what he wanted. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now we have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? He's worthy of death, they said. They answered. All right. Caiaphas is being rather hypocritical here, isn't he? He is rending his clothes in shocked sorrow. But inside, he's gleefully jumping for joy. He has him. He doesn't need any witnesses now because Jesus had blasphemed to the whole room. Everyone has heard it. All right, and they have said, they have concluded now that he's worthy of death. So they've made this decision. Verse 67, then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, prophesy to us, Messiah, who hit you? Now, who was this that was doing this? It was probably not the dignified Sanhedrin, but the Sanhedrin had temple guards. They had other soldiers that were holding Jesus, maybe some people from the mob that came to arrest him. So these are the people that are doing this to Jesus. And now it begins. The mocking begins. And in another gospel, it said that Jesus was blindfolded at this time. And that is why they're saying, prophesy to us, Messiah, who hit you? Now, well, let's talk about Peter's denial. This is such a sad story about a very heroic and courageous man. Peter was all of those things. He loved Jesus so much, and he just had to be there. So verse 69. Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard with the guards, and a servant girl came to him. You also are with Jesus of Galilee, she said. But he denied it before them all. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Denial number 1. Then he went out to the gateway. Okay, so he's getting a little nervous. He's in the courtyard with the guards. Now the guards have heard her say this, and he's getting a little nervous, but he doesn't leave. He doesn't leave. He's brave. He just goes out to the gateway, where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, this fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth. He denied it again with an oath. I don't know the man. Denial number 2. So this time he swears an oath. Said he didn't know him. Now, he may have talked a little too much, because the third denial, after a little while, those standing there with Peter said, surely, they went up to Peter and said, surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away. Talked a little bit too much. So what's this about the accent? Well, of course I don't know what it was or how to act it out. But I read something about the synagogue. They would not, or temple, they would often ask people to read scripture during a meeting. And they would never ask a Galilean to do it because it was just too hard on the ears of the Judeans. So they just, it grated on their ears to hear that accent. So then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know the man. Third denial. Now, this time it said he called down curses. What does that mean? Well, did he possibly curse the name of Jesus? I don't know. but he got very vehement about this. And then what happened? Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken. Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. 1, 2, 3. And the rooster crows. And then another gospel, Luke, said the worst thing ever happened at that moment. Jesus turned and looked at Peter. And he just lost it. He just lost it. And he ran out and he wept bitterly. He was just he was done. He wept and wept. Now, point of interest. I was reading about this, and roosters, hens, poultry were not allowed in the city of Jerusalem while the temple was standing. What? Yes, it's true. They were not allowed in the city of Jerusalem. They were dirty. They had a fear that they would find their way, one of them would find their way somehow into the temple and would defile the temple. So they banned them. So how was Peter going to hear a rooster crow in the middle of the city? Well, it's possible that he could have heard one, outside the city, maybe. And that is possible. But I did read something else I thought was really interesting that I thought you might like to hear. The changing of the guard, or the watch, they had different watches of the night. The 3 a.m. watch before dawn was a trumpet call, and it was called the Gallicinium. And in English, that is translated cockcrow. Gallicinium, cockcrow. So, could Jesus have been talking about the cockcrow? That's what it was called. Before the cockcrow, you will deny me 3 times. Maybe. It's very possible. All right, let's go to, continue on to chapter 27. Early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people came to the decision to put Jesus to death. So this was the second part of the trial. And the whole Sanhedrin got together in their correct meeting place, the official place, and they made the decision, the official decision to put Jesus to death. Now, I also looked this up in the Complete Jewish Bible, and this is how it reads. Early in the morning, all the head Kohanim, which means priests, all the head priests, chief priests, and elders met to plan how to bring about Yeshua's death. Now, Yeshua is Jesus. So here it looks like they are planning to bring about Yeshua's death. It looks like a strategy meeting as well as an official decision. Why? Why did they need to strategize about that? They've already made the decision. Well, it was because the Romans had taken away the power to put someone to death. They weren't allowed to put anyone to death. It had to be a Roman that made that decision, made that command. So they had to figure out some way to force Pilate into condemning Jesus to death. How are they going to do this? Well, let's see. Verse 2, they bound him and led him away and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. So, he's on his way to the governor now. Then we see Judas come back into the picture. It is thought that Judas was at the trial of Jesus and heard everything. So he knows that Jesus is condemned to death. So what happened? When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 silver coins to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. What is he saying? He's telling them, this man is innocent. I know he is innocent. What did the chief priest and elders say? What is that to us? They replied. That's your responsibility. Ooh. Man, that's cruel. First of all, they could care less whether Jesus is guilty or innocent. Judas says that he's innocent, and he knows him well. But they didn't care. They wanted him dead. And then they were very cruel to Judas. They had used Judas as a tool to get what they wanted. And now here, they are blaming Judas. They are putting all of the blame on Judas for the entire deed. They're telling him, it's your responsibility. It's your fault that he is going to die. So, Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. He was full of remorse. He couldn't take it. It was painful for him. And it led him to such despair that he went out and hanged himself. Now, Judas wasn't the only one in despair that night, was he? Peter was in deep, deep despair. But Peter did not take his life, did he? Peter knew Jesus, and he knew Jesus wouldn't want him to do that. But Judas evidently did not understand Jesus like Peter did. He was so filled with remorse, he could not live with himself. And he took his own life. Peter was in much sorrow, but he was begging for forgiveness. Begging for forgiveness. It doesn't say that he was. But he had to have been in a state of despair that caused him so much sorrow, and he was repenting. Oh, if I had never done that, if I just had not done that. And what happened with Peter? Jesus restored him, didn't he? And he would have restored Judas. But Judas had a remorse that did not lead him to a changed life, like Peter. All right, so what are they going to do with this money? It's 30 pieces of silver. You know, they are the chief priests. They couldn't use the money in the temple because, you know, it was dirty money. So what are they going to do with it? Very still hypocritical to the last nth degree. They decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial for foreigners. That is why it has been called the field of blood to this day. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 silver coins the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field as the Lord commanded me. All right, that he is quoting from a prophecy. Now, it's interesting. Jeremiah never wrote that. That is not in the writings of Jeremiah. But it is found in the writings of Zechariah. Zechariah 11, verses 12 and 13. I told them, if you think it best, give me my pay, but if not, keep it. So they paid me 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they priced me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. Wow. I mean, that's very similar. You can see why Matthew is talking about this prophecy here with Judas. But why did he say it was from Jeremiah? Well, one thought is that the transcribers just didn't get it right. They might not have been able to read the word very well when they were transcribing it. Anyway, but another is, when you read here in Matthew 9, it says, then what was spoken by Jeremiah, not written, but spoken by Jeremiah. Remember the oral traditions that we have talked about that were handed down from generation to generation? This very well could have been an oral tradition that Jeremiah, that was handed down from generation to generation from the lips of Jeremiah. And it's possible that Zechariah was moved to write it down. So that's the one I'm going with. But another scholar that I read, he just said, this is a question for future investigation by critical scholars. There you go. All right. Now, let's move on down to verse 11. Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor. So he's standing before the governor. This is called a bema, B-E-M-A. And a bema is a judgment seat. And it was in all the towns where they would have a judge seated. The judge would be sitting up here. The defendant could be up here, could be down here, tied to a post maybe. And then the crowd would be standing down here. All right, so Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Yes, it is as you say, Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. So he would speak to Pilate, but he didn't say anything about what the chief priests said, the chief priests and elders. Pilate asked him, don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you? But Jesus made no reply. He had nothing to say, not a single charge, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now, this was surprising to the governor because he probably had never had a defendant who was being tried for the death penalty to not say anything about his innocence. But Jesus was not going to dignify them with an answer. He just wasn't. So what is Jesus being accused of by the Jewish leaders? First of all, I believe it's in Luke, I'm pretty sure it's Luke, that gives the three charges. First is disrupting the nation. The second charge is opposing the paying of taxes to Caesar. And the third is claiming to be a king, the Messiah. Now, only the third one could even possibly be close to true. Now, Pilate, though, he sees through their plot, and he knows Jesus is innocent of these crimes. He knows it. But, and so as a Roman governor, he is supposed to uphold the law. If he knows someone's innocent, he is supposed to acquit this person. But as a politician, he needs to please the people also. It's important. So he's going to try one last tactic here to free an innocent man. So what is that tactic? Well, now it was the governor's custom at the feast to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. And his first name was actually Jesus Barabbas. Jesus Bar-Abbas, son of Abbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, which one? Now, all right, the crowd is gathering here. Which one do you want me to release to you? Barabbas, Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus, who is called Christ? For he knew it was out of envy that they had handed Jesus over to him. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him a message. Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him. All right, this was very early in the morning. Mark says that Jesus wasn't crucified until 9 o'clock in the morning. So this was very early. They probably woke Pilate up and got him out of bed to come here to the judgment seat. So then his wife has this nightmare. So it must have been quite the nightmare to interrupt him as he is on the judgment seat. So, and then it says, but the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. All right, let's talk a little bit about the crowd. Who makes up this crowd? Is it people that Jesus has healed? Is it people who Jesus has taught? Are they good Jews, ones that obey the law and love God? I doubt it. This crowd was gathered. I believe this crowd was gathered by the chief priests and the elders. And they brought them there, maybe paid a little bit to them. And they brought them there. They were rebel rousers, kind of like a mob. And because if this was Passover, the day of Passover was the day that they slaughtered the lambs. They were getting things ready for Passover. A good Jew was getting things ready for Passover, for the feast, which would start at twilight that day. Well, right now, it is still in the early morning hours. So they're about to get up and start preparing for the feast. They're not here this early in the morning. And now you have the chief priests and elders. They're all glasses. They are, what does it say? The chief priests and elders are persuading the crowd now. They're back there. They're persuading the crowd to ask for whom? Jesus Barabbas. And then they're persuading them to have Jesus executed. This is what we want you to say. Pilate's going to ask, this is what we want you to say. Remember what happened at the early morning meeting in the plan, the strategy session? They had to make sure that Pilate was going to condemn Jesus. This was all a part of the plan. Do you remember last week when we talked about Caiaphas, he was in his palace with the teachers of the law, the elders, and they said, we cannot risk a mob during Passover, because Caiaphas was afraid that the Romans, if they heard about a mob during Passover, that they would take him out of office of the high priest and put someone else in his place. So he could not afford a riot. But now, he's not in the hot seat anymore. Who is in the hot seat? Pilate. Pilate is in the hot seat. So, we are about to read how the Sanhedrin, the chief priests, the elders, are manipulating the crowd to force Pilate to condemn Jesus by attempting to start a riot. So, Pilate is nervous about the same thing that Caiaphas was nervous about before. He doesn't want a riot, because if he has a riot, Rome might take him out of office, and he didn't want that. All right, so let's see how this unfolds. All right, so they're persuading the crowd to ask for Barabbas to have Jesus executed. Here, Pilate says, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. Jesus, Barabbas. Barabbas, they answered. "What shall I do then with Jesus who is called Christ?" Pilate asked. Then they all answered, "Crucify him." Why? What crime has he committed? He hasn't committed a crime. Not worthy of crucifixion. But they all shouted the louder, "Crucify him!" When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It's your responsibility." All the people answered, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them. But he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. So, Pilate released a guilty man, and he condemned an innocent man to crucifixion. Now, this washing of the hands in front of the crowd, found something interesting that I want to share. Turn to Deuteronomy 21, verses 1 through 9. If someone, I'm not going to read the whole thing, I'm just going to paraphrase, but if someone was found murdered outside the city by an unknown person, they found this person, there was no one to accuse. The elders were to do certain things. They were to take a heifer. It had to be the elders of the nearest town were called forth. So they would break the head of a heifer, take it out, and then they would wash their hands over this heifer with the broken neck. And they would say, now I'm shortening it some if you're reading. "Our hands did not shed this blood, except this atonement. Do not hold your people guilty of the blood of an innocent person." So it looks like that Pilate had heard about this custom, this law, and he was using it to absolve himself of guilt for Jesus. But it didn't absolve him, did it? No, because Pilate was the only one who could pronounce this sentence on Jesus. Pilate was the one to put Jesus to death. So he is guilty. And then he says, it's your responsibility. Well, the crowd was so worked up. They said, yeah, we'll take the responsibility. It'll be on us and our children. So Pilate hands him over to be crucified. Now, Jesus says he was flogged. This is something that they usually, well, from what I read, a flogging, a scourging, always came before a crucifixion. And most of you probably know what scourging is. They took a whip and tied glass and real sharp rocks on the end, and they would tie them where their back was open to the whip, and then they would whip him, and probably 39 times. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I will tell you that men died from the scourging alone. Also, men would, if they didn't die, some of them would, just the pain that went along with this caused them to lose their mind. It was so painful. But all men who went through it were extremely weakened because of loss of blood and this pain. Jesus more so, because Jesus felt the pain probably even more, because John tells us that, I believe it's John, tells us that when he was in the garden praying, that it was so intense that he sweat like drops of blood. And that can happen. And from what I understand medically, it leaves your skin very tender and tender to the touch, and it would bother you really badly if someone touched you. Well, Jesus had already been slapped and hit, and now he's being flogged, so his pain was probably intensified because of what happened to him in the garden. So, verse 27, then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium. Now, my mom took a picture of the praetorium in Jerusalem, and they gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. Now, a whole company of soldiers would be 600, but I read that it's doubtful that Pilate would have had a whole company there in the praetorium at that time. So everybody that was around, all the soldiers, they gathered around Jesus. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And keep in mind, this was after the scourging. After the scourging. And then they twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. Not set it, but set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand and knelt in front of him and mocked him. "Hail, King of the Jews," they said. They spit on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again and again and again. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Now these men, they were soldiers, Romans. They probably didn't know much about Jesus. And they had heard that he said he was a king. So they mocked him just like they would mock any other criminal that they were about to crucify. They were having their fun with Jesus. It's the man's inhumanity to man. Then they led him away to crucify him. Now I've got a map of the city, and it's thought that this was the way of the cross. This dotted line here, dash line. And I wanted to show you, this is a game. It looks like a game. This was found in the Praetorium. And evidently the soldiers, when they didn't have a prisoner to hurt, they would play this game. It's just interesting. I thought you'd like to see it. And then this is a mosaic at the back of Pilate's Hall. My mom took this. And this could be going from the Praetorium down this hall. But it is a mosaic of Jesus and the cross, carrying the cross. Next week, we will talk about the crucifixion, and we will end next week with great joy as Jesus rises from the dead. So we will see you for our last lesson next week. Bye-bye now.